Hello again. Like many people, I suspect, I'm growing a little weary of hearing about the slavery in the Caribbean, which ended in 1839, almost 200 years ago. Slavery has existed in the world since before the dawn of recorded history, and it's still going strong to this day, especially in Africa. But we only ever seem to hear about the black slaves in the Caribbean or the United States. This is odd because in some ways black slaves in the islands of the Caribbean were not treated as badly as many of the white people living in that part of the world. Why this should have been the case is an interesting story. We have most of us heard of British criminals being transported to Australia, but not everybody knows that this practice originally began with the Caribbean and Britain's colonies in North America. Before a large number of slaves were brought to the Caribbean from West Africa, the rough and heavy work on plantations was done by white people. Principally, those transported there as punishment, as an alternative to being hanged in many cases, or sometimes as indentured servants. The prospect of transportation to islands like Barbados was viewed with horror by many criminals, and it was regarded as a slow and lingering death rather than the quick, clean one provided by the gallows. Men were worked to death in the Caribbean, and they had no redress at all in law. They could be beaten and starved, mistreated just as black slaves were later to be. In 1634, 86% of the population of Barbados were white, and all the heavy work was undertaken either by those who had been sent there as punishment or by indentured servants. Indentured servants were very poor people who were often in England on the edge of starvation, and they agreed to be bound to an employer for a certain period of years, typically 7, sometimes 10. It was a way of escaping the grinding poverty and threat of dying of starvation. The employer would draw up a contract and agree to pay somebody's passage to the Caribbean or North America and to feed and house the man or woman in exchange for the set period of labour. However, those who agreed to such arrangements did not realise that once in the Caribbean they would be in effect the property of a master who could do with them as he pleased. Women could be raped and men beaten with no recourse at all to law. The contract could be sold to others, and so the indentured servant who had just crossed the Atlantic and arrived in the Caribbean often found him or herself in effect being auctioned off and sold to another owner on arrival. Some people were kidnapped by gangs in British ports and taken against their will to be sold in this way to plantation owners. There was every incentive for the masters to treat these people far worse than any of the black slaves. A slave was owned for life and so, like a useful animal, had to be kept reasonably healthy so that as many years of hard work as possible could be extracted from the person. Since the indentured workers were only his for a certain number of years, sometimes 7, 10, perhaps as few as 5, he wished to get as much work out of the man or woman as possible while spending as little on food as could be. That way you would maximise your profit from the initial payment. This meant that many such workers were overworked and neglected. Quite a few died before their period of servitude had ended. A French historian writing in the 17th century of this system said, "There were masters so cruel that they were forbidden to purchase any more, and I knew one at Guadalupe who had buried more than 50 men on his plantation, whom he had killed by hard work and neglect when they were sick. The cruelty proceeded from their having them for only a few years, which made them spare the Negro rather than these poor creatures." The white workers were actually cheaper than black slaves and were in that respect disposable. There was a steady supply of white workers for the plantations because prisoners of war were also sent to labour in the Caribbean. During the English Civil War, some 10,000 men were shipped off there in this way, and when Cromwell took over, he did the same with Irish prisoners. To this day on the island of Montserrat, Irish names like Sweeney, Riley and so on are still common. The same thing happened after the Duke of Monmouth's failed rebellion in the West Country in 1685. Many men from Somerset were sent off into slavery in Barbados. I can't help wondering if the people living in Somerset and Devon still have a chip on their shoulders about the fact that their ancestors were treated like this, or if any white person at all ever stops to think that his ancestors might have included slaves. Probably not. It was, after all, centuries ago. I do rather hope that the time will come when black Caribbeans will stop harping on about their sufferings and start acknowledging that what their own ancestors went through was anything but unique.